Yo guys, what is up? Here we are with another reading video, and today we are on the last chapter already. Well, actually, no. It took most of January, February, and March. But anyway, still shorter than The Only Thing to Fear took us. That took us a while. Like, a while. Anyway, but we are here, we are ready. It's the last chapter, chapter 15 of Lost in the Pacific 1942 by Todd Olson. But one more thing before we begin. The next book will be Milkweed. So the problem is that I'm going to need some time to figure out how the heck I'm going to obtain and keep Milkweed since I do not own Milkweed. So my plan is that I'm going to probably take 2 weeks, the next 2 weeks, and take a little break and just figure things out. Plus, I'll probably start recording because I need some videos in advance. Because you can probably tell that I haven't been getting videos out Saturdays 8:30 a.m., you know? So anyway, let's get right into it. Chapter 15, The Ones Not Taken. News of the rescue traveled fast, from Funafuti to Hawaii to Washington, D.C. Bill Sherry's wife was the first to find out. She got a phone call at the aircraft factory in Dallas, where she worked. It was Friday, the 13th. It must be my luckiest day, she said. Adelaide Rickenbacker was in her New York City apartment the next morning when General Hap Arnold called. I have good news for you, he said. She went on the radio Sunday with the message for all the other mothers and wives who were waiting for news from the front. Never, never give up hope. John Bartek's mother, Mary, claimed she had never given up on her son. Then she told the reporter, it's still hard to believe. Newspaper reporters all across the country got on the phone and knocked on doors, looking for reactions to the rescue. Swell, said the New York City mayor, Fiore LaGuardia. He's Italian. When he heard that Rickenbacker was alive. Thank God, said Jack Glenn, a retired morgue keeper interviewed by the New York reporter. He's beep lucky. He's got more lives than a cat. He must have a rabbit's foot or something, said Eddie's brother William. Millions of people soaked up the news of the rescue that weekend. There wasn't a lot of detail yet, but most of the commentators didn't care. If you believe the newspapers, this survival story wasn't just about 7 men. It was a triumph for a nation at war. Rickenbacker and the crew showed that the American men have the courage and resourcefulness it takes to come through harrowing ordeals and win wars, said the Minneapolis Evening Star. The fact that Americans hadn't given up the search proved to a Memphis, Tennessee newspaper that we are not a people who hold life cheaply. The rescue demonstrated the U.S. military's increasing mastery of the air and sea, according to Everett Herald in Washington. If American planes could pluck 3 tiny rafts from such a vast stretch of ocean, how could the Japanese or the Germans or the Italians possibly hide from us? Of course, Rickenbacker, Whitaker, Bartek, and the rest hadn't read the papers yet. They were just 7 men lying in a makeshift hospital in the middle of the Pacific, relieved to be alive. Little did they know they'd become a sign that millions of American soldiers were not risking their lives in vain. On December 10th, Eddie Rickenbacker peered out the window of a B-17. This time, he was not lost. A few hundred feet below lay the thick jungle of Guadalcanal. A month ago, Rickenbacker was nearly dead from thirst and starvation. Now he was back to work. After their rescue, the men had been reunited in Funafuti. Whitaker had weathered the ordeal better than the rest. He walked into the one-room hospital under his own power and saw a shrunken Rickenbacker lying in a bed. What's the matter, Rick? He said with a grin. Been sick? After regaining some strength in Funafuti, the survivors flew to Samoa, where they spent a couple of weeks recovering in a hospital. Then Whitaker, Sherry, DeAndres, and Bartek flew home to Hawaii. Adamson and Reynolds stayed in Samoa for treatment. Whitaker took off for the Western Pacific. He'd lost a couple dozen pounds, but he was still the man he had been on October 21st, when he insisted the crew take off in an uninspected plane. Uninspected plane, yeah. He was determined to complete his mission. Guadalcanal was the last stop, and as his B-17 touched down, he could already tell it was, in his words, a beep hole. The landing strip was nothing but a scar in the jungle. On either side, the ground was littered with the twisted wreckage of planes. Pilots called it the graveyard. Rickenbacker was deeply disturbed by the conditions on the island. The rainy season had just started, and there was mud everywhere. Daily bombings ripped holes in the airfield, and tents that housed the Marines. When the men scrambled to save themselves from the bombs, they landed in foxholes waist-deep with water. Mosquitoes came in swarms. Malaria, dysentery, and meager food rations left everyone weak and feverish. Everything, the colonel reported, seems to rot away in the damp. While Rickenbacker had been out on the rafts, the Marines at the airfield and the Japanese soldiers trying to take it back had also been fighting for their lives. By December, it looked like the Marines had won the advantage. Most likely, Guadalcanal was in American hands for good. But both sides had paid a heavy price. Nearly 40,000 men would die before the end of the campaign. After one anxious night on the island, Rickenbacker took off on the final leg of this trip. He scanned the waters below. About 40 miles off the southern tip of Guadalcanal, he might have seen stray wreckage from a cruiser called the USS Genoa. The Genoa was one of about 60 ships destroyed in a 6-month battle for the island. It was hit by a torpedo on November 13th. About 24 hours after Rickenbacker was plucked from the sea by William Eddy's seaplane, the torpedo hit the Genoa's ammunition stores, and a massive explosion rocked the sea. The ship split in two and sunk in less than a minute. Ships from Genoa's squadron thought for sure no one had survived. In fact, more than 100 sailors clung to 3 rafts and bits of wreckage in the sea. Like Rickenbacker and the B-17 crew, the castaways were left without food or drinking water. They were tormented by sharks and helpless against the sun and the sea. But there was nothing inspiring about the way this story ended. The Navy knew there were survivors where the survivors were, and yet messages were lost in the confusion of battle. When it came clear what had happened, the Navy delayed the rescue for fear the Japanese were still patrolling the area. Rescue planes finally arrived 6 days after the battle. Only 10 men were alive. The rest had died from their wounds, from thirst, or from shark attacks. By the time Rickenbacker got back to Samoa, Amundsen and Reynolds were ready to travel. The 3 of them flew back to the States, and the men went their separate ways. Rickenbacker had a tearful reunion with Adelaide and their 2 sons, then went immediately to the Pentagon to report his mission. Sherry went to Washington, D.C. to help redesign the Air Force's survival equipment. Whitaker went on tour telling his story to war workers on the Pacific coast. Bartek went home to see his parents and embarked on a speaking tour of his own. Everywhere they traveled, the men were welcomed like heroes. When DeAngelis came home to Nesquoing, Pennsylvania, there were 4,000 people in the streets to greet him, more than the entire population of the town. "I knew I had friends," he said, "but I didn't know I had this many." Eddy, of course, got the biggest reception of all. A military band greeted him whenever he touched down in Washington, D.C. Once again, the newspapers hailed his courage, his darling, and his determination. The rest of the crew didn't feel as warm towards Rickenbacker. In public, they said all the right things, but they remembered the tirades and power struggles they'd endured in the open ocean. A navigator on board the plane that flew them back to Hawaii overheard one of the men saying, "We stayed alive on that raft just to watch that son of a beep get all the credit." In fact, as the men told and retold the story of their ordeal, they gave all the credit to a higher authority than Rickenbacker, God. They didn't have a lot to rely on out there besides Bartek's Bible and their own prayers. To most of the men, their survival began to seem like part of a divine plan. For Whitaker, it was a full-on conversion experience. In the bomber, before the ordeal, he had been scornful when DeAngelis wanted to pray. By the end, he was convinced that God had been watching over the rafts. He took the bird that landed on Rickenbacker's head as a sign that prayers get answered. When a rain squall appeared to travel against the wind to dump fresh water on them, it seemed like a miracle. He wrote a book about the ordeal, called "We Thought We Heard the Angels Sing." Like Whitaker, Bartek claimed he hadn't been especially religious as a kid. In January, 2 months after they'd been rescued, he told an audience of war workers that he wanted to become a minister. "After what happened to us out there, I feel I'm a true believer," he said. One voice, of course, was absent from all the post-rescue storytelling. That was the voice of Alex Kay. History has left no record of his mother's beliefs. We only know that she hadn't heard about the rescue yet when the phone rang on November 14th. There was a reporter on the line, calling to talk about her son's death. She burst into tears. "He was the only one," she cried, and hung up the phone. In 1942, millions of people had to live with the news that someone close to them had been stolen away. In 22 days, 7 men had survived on Rasp Pacific. In that same 22 days, more than 2,000 Americans died in battle. On the U.S. Genoa alone, 90 men were left to die in the ocean, while Rickenbacker and the B-17 crew drank soup and fruit juice on the Funafuti. And the fighting stretched across the globe, from Guadalcanal to China to Eastern Europe to North Africa. On average, in every 3-week period of the war, more than 500,000 people died. Each one of those deaths led to an announcement, a letter, a phone call, a knock at the door, and each announcement left a person at home to wonder why their son, their daughter, their husband had been killed while others survived. At least some of those people read the New York Times on November 14th. 2 weeks after the rescue of Rickenbacker and the crew. They might have seen a small article at the bottom of page 24 that puzzled over the meaning of the crew's survival. We do not know why death sometimes comes so close, then goes away. Often he takes the very bravest. This we know. He takes the generous, who give up their place in the lifeboat. He takes the compassionate, who will not let a wounded man suffer unaided between the lines. He takes those who love liberty so much that they will not bow to the oppressor. We shall never pierce this mystery, the article went on. We can only rejoice that brave men sometimes come safely home from the desperate peril. And that is the end of the book. I hope you guys liked this book. If you did, make sure to leave a big thumbs up, comment down below, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in the next video.